Your lunch, Mrs. Troy.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. Put it down.
Prawn and crab sticks with iceberg lettuce.
Good.
Tuna mayonnaise with sweet corn.
Thank you.
Egg and tomato with coleslaw. And carrot cake with yoghurt topping.
Fine. I'll pay you next week.
Next week.
Hang on. No flapjacks?
Oh, no, they didn't have any today.
Oh, I suppose I just have to go hungry then.
Yes. Looks familiar, Mrs. Troy.
It should do. There's probably one on every mantelpiece between here and John O'Groats.
Oh, yes. We used to have a big poster of it once on our sitting room wall.
Did you? We used to cover our damp patch with a mirror.
I think it's lovely.
Do you? It's a bit twee for me, all big eyes and Bambi. Could put you off your lunch.
What was it called again? What a Charmer.
No, you're thinking of What a Scorcher. That's called Whose Little Girl Are You?
That's it. And the photographer was that famous fellow, Fortnum.
Mason.
That's right, yes. It must be quite an old photograph now. How many years has it been about?
Ooh, 30 years or so. Mason's being sued over it.
Over the photograph? Of a baby? Who's suing him?
The baby.
Of course, she's not a baby anymore, Mrs. Troy.
No, well, you'd expect some change in her appearance after 30 years. It'd be a shame if she was still stuck in her pram, sucking her big toe.
Very good of you to come to the studio, Mrs. Troy. There's not a lot of barristers who would stir from their chambers to visit a client.
When you share your chambers with the sort of waxworks I do, Arthur, you're glad to get out of the place. Besides, when I get a lion for a client, I like to beard him in his den.
Yes, over there. A bit of an arrogant lot, some of them in your chambers, Mrs. Troy, if you don't mind me saying.
Oh, do you think so?
Yes, I mean, we solicitors are a pretty modest lot by comparison. But a lot of barristers seem to have this sort of attitude as though, I don't know, they're doing a favour just by talking to you.
Well, we usually are, aren't we? People pay for my opinions. You'd have a hard job giving yours away. Although you're right. There is an arrogant element in the profession. It reflects very badly on the rest of us.
Yes, quite.
Well, get on with it, Arthur. Ring the bell. You're sure you're not expecting me to do it?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
It's like a hit record, Mrs. Troy. Where there's a hit, there's a writ. Sugar?
No, thank you. It was a writ a long time a-coming, then.
Yeah, well, it takes some insects a long while to crawl out the woodwork.
You've never been sued before, Mr. Mason?
Not for this, no. No, I've been taken to the cleaners for alimony often enough. It seems to me that the divorce court should call itself sketchless.
These are very good.
Yeah, 4 a.m. on the soup run. See how the other half lives.
In acute discomfort, by the look of it. Have you seen these faces, Arthur?
Yes, they certainly look lived in.
It looks as though they've been parked on to me.
No, I hate anything posed, you know. Snap, get the moment, real life. Not a load of rubbish like Whose Little Girl Are You?
No, I wouldn't call it rubbish.
You'd bin it, though, wouldn't you, Mrs. Troy?
It's not quite my cup of tea.
No, but it's my bread and butter. Do you know 20 million copies of that sold worldwide? I get 10 pence a copy. Snap a kid in a park one afternoon, it's your pension.
This is a straightforward and very simple case, my lord. A case as black as it is white, as tall as it is long, as narrow as it is wide, and indeed as open as it is...
Shut.
You said that about the fraudulent dealing, Mr. Triggs. We didn't go home for 17 weeks. Proceed to the point, then.
If counsel needs any assistance in that direction, my lord, I'll be happy to provide him with a map reference.
The plaintiff, Miss Kathleen Jerome, was at the time the wrong was committed and her rights infringed.
Alleged wrongs, my lord, and alleged rights. Two allegations do not amount to an infringement.
Mrs. Troy, could you possibly spare us these continuous interruptions?
So, with respect, my lord, I think your lordship means continual interruptions. Continuous comes to an end. Continual goes on relentlessly.
Then continual it plainly is, Mrs. Troy. Continue, Mr. Triggs.
At the time the disputed photograph was taken, my lord, she was then naught but a babe in arms.
I thought the baby was in a pram, Mr. Triggs.
Yes, she was naught but a babe in arms in a pram, my lord.
Was somebody carrying the pram? Where was that? Had the wheels fallen off?
I was speaking figuratively, my lord.
I listen literally, Mr. Triggs.
I merely wish to convey her almost biblical innocence as she lay, like Moses, in his Moses basket. For is it not, as the Gospels say, suffer the little children to come unto me?
It is us who appear to be doing the suffering now, Mr. Triggs.
We, my lord.
Yes, indeed.
So, Miss Jerome was but a babe in arms, my lord, in a pram on a warm day in June, in a sun hat to ward off the sun, when her photograph was taken by the defendant and then ruthlessly exploited for every penny it was worth. And many a penny it was worth, my lord, and yet not one penny apiece of all those many a pennies has ever found its way to the plaintiff, though they have long lined the pockets of the defendant. In fact, if I may quote, my lord, somewhat aptly from St. Paul's epistle to the Corinthians, when I was a child, I spake as a child.
Yes, only you're a barrister now, Mr. Triggs. Can we get on with the case?
Yes, well, I'd like to call Miss Kathleen Jerome this time, my lord.
Miss Kathleen Jerome.
Speak up, man. I can hardly hear you.
Sorry, touch of laryngitis.
He's getting too old for this, you know.
I'm not just
And finally, how long have you known, Miss Jerome, that you were that little girl in the photograph?
Almost ever since I can remember.
Thank you.
Mrs. Troy, you have some pertinent inquiries?
I do, my lord.
Inquire pertinently away, then.
Miss Jerome, you have always known that you were the girl in the photograph. How long exactly is always?
Since I was 4 or 5.
Oh, and presumably you have some good grounds for believing this. I assume your own recollection as an 8-month-old would be somewhat hazy.
Yes, but my mother always said that it was me and she kept a copy of the photograph. It appeared in a newspaper a few days after it was taken.
Oh, so your mother was with you in the park that day, at the business end of the pram?
No, not her. I was taken there by my nanny.
Your nanny, Miss Jerome. Yes, indeed. I had a nanny myself once. And even now, I still can't put my... Carry on, Mrs. Troy.
May I ask how old you are, Miss Jerome?
How old, Mrs. Troy? That is hardly a gentlemanly question.
Ah, but for a mere woman to have the presumption to ask a gentlemanly question in court, my lord, would scarcely be ladylike.
Miss Jerome...
I'm 35.
Oh. So, for some 30-something years, you have always known that you were the girl in the photograph, and yet you have only now seen fit to make any kind of claim. Why did you not initiate proceedings before? Why the long hiatus, Miss Jerome?
I rather naively didn't realise that Mr. Mason was making so much money out of it in royalties.
Ah, and you thought you might like to have a share of those royalties, that there was room for another bucket in the well, another hand in the till.
Another leg in the bed, Mrs. Troy.
As your lordship pleases. Miss Jerome?
I certainly felt it was unjust that he was making so much money out of me when I didn't receive a penny myself.
And did you write to Mr. Mason to this effect?
Yes, but he sent back what was obviously a standard letter, implying that he received a lot of claims of this nature from people trying to cash in on his success, and it wasn't his policy to entertain them.
And isn't that precisely what you are trying to do, Miss Jerome? To take a jump from a standing start onto somebody else's bandwagon?
Certainly not. I just want what's fairly mine, a share in the profits of the exploitation of my own image.
If it is your image, of course, Miss Jerome.
Well, that's what we're here to establish, I think.
And from what we have heard so far, it must surely still wait to be established. Thank you, Miss Jerome. No further questions.
Mr. Triggs, your next witness.
I wish to call Nanny Rachel Evans, my lord.
No, not Nanny Welshaw.
Rachel, my lord.
Oh, yes. Yes. It's all right. The ghost has just tiptoed over my grave. That's right.
Call Miss Nanny Rachel.
And nothing but the truth. You should gargle with some TCP for that.
Now, Mrs. Evans, I'd like
Nanny.
I'm sorry?
I prefer to be addressed by my professional title, Nanny Rachel, not Mrs. Evans.
Yes, I can quite understand that. Now, Mrs. Evans,
Nanny. Nanny Rachel.
I think Nanny knows best, Mr. Triggs. She always does.
Nanny it is, my lord. Now then, Nanny Rachel, I'm sure that you must be very familiar with St. Paul's epistle to the Corinthians.
No, I'm sorry, sir. I have always made it my rule never to open another person's correspondence. If it's not addressed to me, I don't open it.
Then let us just pass over that matter. Let me ask you to cast your mind back some 30-something years. Can you remember what you were doing at the time?
Yes, I was a nanny. I've always been a nanny.
And to paraphrase the title of the photograph, whose little nanny were you?
Are you being impertinent, young man? In my day, a good smack cured more than bedwetting.
No. Let me rephrase the question. Can you remember in whose employment you were at the time, Nanny Rachel?
Certainly. Miss Jerome's mother employed me to look after her. Miss Jerome's mother was a professional woman who had recently divorced her husband, which was still quite a scandal in those days. But I was kind enough to overlook it, as she seems to have good references. So I took her on and looked after little Kathleen.
I see. Now, can you cast your mind back to that summer of...
1958.
The summer of 1958, when the date would be
June the 19th.
Indeed, June the 19th. And can you tell us what happened on that day?
Yes, of course, that's why I'm here. I took little Kathleen. Oh, she was a lovely baby. It's a shame she never married. But she would put her elbows on the table. I took her into the park in her pram, as I usually did when it was fine.
The pram we see in the photograph?
Yes, Silver Cross, very good prams. I wouldn't push anything else.
And was Kathleen wearing a sun hat at the time?
Of course she was. It was hot. Stupid question.
Perhaps you'd like to tell us what happened then, Nanny Rachel, in your own words.
Well, they're bound to be my own words, aren't they? Who else's words would I use? I'm not a parrot.
Let's just sit down and listen, Mr. Triggs, and let it all wash over us, shall we?
Well, Mrs. Jerome had given me her camera, a Brownie Kodak, if I remember. Very good cameras. I only ever worked for families with Brownie Kodaks. And she asked me to take a picture of Kathleen in her pram. And I was just doing so when I was approached by a man.
A man?
Yes, a man. We had them then. Not like And I was about to give him short shrift because you were always being approached by men in the park, especially in uniform.
Men in uniform?
No, I was in uniform. Very and damages. But he seemed politely spoken and asked if he could take a photo of Kathleen as he was trying to take some summer shots that he could sell to the papers. Well, I couldn't see any harm in it. So he took the photograph and it first appeared a few days after in one of the dailies.
Of Kathleen?
Yes. And after that, it just sort of snowballed, and soon you were seeing it everywhere.
And you see the man who took the photograph in court today. Was that man Mr. Mason?
I don't know.
You don't know?
Not with certainty, no. People change over the years. It might be him, but I'm not positive. And I'm here to tell the truth as I know it, and not to perjure myself for your convenience, even if you did pay for the taxi.
Indeed not, Nanny Rachel, nor would we wish you to. But irrespective of who took the photograph, you do believe it to be of Kathleen taken on that day?
Yes. To the best of my knowledge, that's Kathleen, yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
Mrs. Troy, your nanny.
Nanny Rachel,
Yes.
I am Barrister Philippa.
We all know who you are, Mrs. Troy. Why is another question. Proceed.
Now, Nanny Rachel, you've been a nanny all your working life, haven't you?
Yes, about 40 years, except for the time I took off to have my own family.
Who you brought up yourself, I presume.
No, I employed a nanny so I could go on with my nannying work. These things are best left to the professionals. I wouldn't have been happy just bringing up children.
Now, in the light of your professional experience, would you not say that, unique as they are to their mothers, in many ways, one baby in a sun hat is much like another?
Some might think so.
And isn't one pram much like another, and one park much like another, and one sunny day much like another? And doesn't memory play tricks on us all, Nanny Rachel?
Not on me, it doesn't.
No, it wouldn't dare. Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Troy. Now, as we're teetering on the verge of luncheon anyway, let's resume at 2. Now, if anyone in court is at all fond of Eastern food, may I suggest the new Singapore lunch counter across the street, where the Raffles burger and noodles and the Sadie Thompson pudding are highly recommended. Court adjourned.
Court will rise.
You see, in a criminal case, the defendant's guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. But in a civil case like this one, the burden of proof is not so arduous and is decided on the balance of probability.
I believe you me, Mrs. Troy, there's no way the baby in that photograph is Kathleen Jerome. It's a physical impossibility.
If you say so, Mr. Mason, but why are you so sure?
I'm sure, Mrs. Troy, because I'm sure.
Fine. Only if you won't cooperate, how do I convince Judge Wallace? Any suggestions?
No,
Would you like to settle?
not for what she's asking.
Well, if I could get them to compromise.
If compromise is another word for cheap, yeah.
It may be. My client may be prepared to settle, actually, Gerald.
Might he? Mm-hmm.
If the terms were right, would yours?
She might do if the terms were favourable.
Oh, would she?
How much did he have in mind?
Why, what was she thinking of?
Well, in terms of a general estimate,
Just to take a ballpark figure.
roughly speaking,
In the region of...
no, that's grossly inadequate.
No, I'm afraid that's far too much. Unless you have any room for manoeuvre there.
If you have any latitude,
Well, I could maybe go up to...
I could maybe come down to...
Yes?
Yes. No. Any luck?
No. There's something Mason isn't telling us, Arthur. If you ask me, he'd sooner lose the case than say what it is.
Yes. I think I'm getting hemorrhoids, you know, Mrs. Troy.
Oh, good. Well, we'll be able to cite them in evidence, won't we?
Pardon?
Look, there is nothing wrong with you, Arthur. It is all in your mind.
Well, it doesn't feel like it, especially when I sit down. My wife got me some things from a chemist for it, but they taste absolutely dreadful. Are you going to put Mason in the stand?
No, he'd be useless. I must get an adjournment.
No, I'm sorry, Mrs. Troy. I can't quite hear what you've been saying.
I was about to call a witness, my lord.
Speak up, Mrs. Troy. Have you picked up this bug that seems to be going around? Is that it?
You may be right, my lord. It could be the bug.
Is that what you're trying to tell us?
Yes, my lord. I think I might be losing my voice. My voice, my lord.
Oh, well, in that case, we'd better adjourn the court until tomorrow, when presumably you'll have recovered. And next time you lose your voice, Mrs. Troy, don't be afraid to speak up about it. Court adjourned.
Court adjourned.
Night, Philippa.
Night, Harold.
Burning the midnight oil?
Scraping the midnight barrel.
Oh, dear. Well, they'll be closed shortly. I'm just popping over to Wagstaff's.
Oh, Harold, you're a bit of an amateur snapper, aren't you? Do you know this?
Yes. Whose little girl are you? Mason took it, didn't he? School of Realism.
What does that mean exactly?
Oh, you know, naturalism. Capturing the spontaneous moment. Hiding behind a lamppost with a camera for 6 months, waiting for the right pair of legs to walk by. Yes, he built his whole reputation on it.
So he wouldn't use models?
Oh, no, nothing posed. He scorns all that. It's all pure spur-of-the-moment stuff. Why?
I just wondered how important it was.
Very, if you've built your whole reputation on it. Anyway, I must dash. I'll see you in the morning. Don't forget to go home.
No. Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, hello, Arthur. Sorry to bother you on your mobile. You're sitting on the what? Oh, the train. Yes, look, I know Mason had a lot of wives. Did he ever have any children? Oh, just a son. Well, see if you can get hold of him anyway, will you? Yeah, fine. Bye. Prickly Peter packs a bag. New paragraph. It's going to be a long night, Prickly Peter said, but then that's all part of being a hedgehog. Oh, did I stop you? Oh, no, let me pick it up.
Thank you.
There you are.
Thank you.
Not at all.
It's Mrs. Troy, isn't it?
Yes.
It's about this case you've been doing, Kathleen Jerome. I've been following it in the papers.
Yes.
It's something I think you ought to know.
Why? Who are you?
Well, I'm her father.
And that concludes the watertight case for the plaintiff, my lord.
Thank you, Miss Triggs, and a very well presented and cogently argued case it was. I particularly appreciated St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, quoted in all its entirety. Mrs. Troy, you have any passing remarks of some small consequence, do you, to pad out the defence?
No, my lord, but I would like to call Mr. Albert Harrison.
Call Mr. Herbert Bannister. Fully recovered, are we, Mr. Stanley?
Who's this Harrison?
Don't worry, Mr. Mason. Mrs. Troy is going to win the case for you.
Yes, that's what's beginning to worry me.
Mr. Harrison, Mr. Albert Harrison. Is that correct?
Albert Percival Harrison in full, ma'am. That's right, yes.
Have you ever been married, Mr. Harrison?
Yes, twice. Divorced once, widowed once.
Any children?
A daughter from my first marriage and 2 sons.
And what was your daughter's name, Mr. Harrison?
Kathleen.
Kathleen.
Yes, though she took her mother's surname, Kathleen Jerome.
Dad? Dad, is it really you?
Hello, Kathy.
Dad?
Order. I will not have such consolation. This is a court of law, not a missing persons bureau. Now, is this man your father, Miss Jerome?
Yes, my lord. I believe he is.
Ah, well, yes. Most touching, yes. Father and daughter reunion. I seem to have something in my eye, Mrs. Troy. Could you carry on?
When was the last time you saw Kathleen, Mr. Harrison?
Oh, long ago, when she was still a baby. Her mother and I divorced, and I was going away to start afresh. So I went to the house the day before I left to see Kathy one last time and hoping to take a photograph so that I'd have something of her. But she wasn't there, so I walked around till I found her in the park with her nanny Rachel. Well, I knew she wouldn't let me near her if she knew who I was, so I pretended to be a reporter so she'd let me take Kathy's photograph, which she did. And when the nanny wasn't looking, I kissed little Kathleen goodbye. And The next day I left and we lost touch. But I still have that photograph. It's rather faded now, very like the other one, but you can see when you compare them, Kathleen was the lovelier baby.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. No further questions.
Mr. Trigg?
Mr. Harrison, if you are the man who photographed Kathleen, and if Kathleen is not the baby in the Whose Little Girl Are You picture taken by Mr. Mason, then who is?
Maybe you better ask him.
Mrs. Troy, do you intend to call Mr. Mason?
I do, my lord. Mr. Justin Mason, that is.
Justin? What's he doing here?
Call Mr.
I don't want him called.
Too late.
Mr. Mason, do you recognise this photograph?
Yes, it's a very well-known one called Whose Little Girl Are You?
And do you know who this little girl in the photograph is, Mr. Mason?
Yes, it's me.
It's you, Mr. Mason?
Yes, my lord.
Well, presumably you haven't had some kind of radical surgical appendage attachment since the photograph was taken. Are we to presume, then, that Whose Little Girl Are You is, in fact, a little boy?
That's correct, my lord.
Perhaps you'd care to enlarge on that, Mr. Mason.
Well, John Mason, the defendant, is my father. He was a young and struggling photographer at the time and needed to make some money. And the newspapers were always looking for the right kind of photograph. So he and my mother took me to the park, took a lot of photographs, apparently, but they didn't work.
They didn't work in what way?
They weren't cute enough, I suppose, for what he was aiming at.
But I thought your father didn't aim at anything. I thought he just shot life as it happened.
Yes, I think that's probably why we're all here.
And so?
Well, so Dad decided that things might work out better if I was a little girl. I had blonde hair as a baby. So he sent Mum off to buy me a pink sun hat, bought me an ice cream, took the photograph, and the rest I think you know about. That was the result. Whose little girl are you?
And none of you ever told anyone?
I didn't. It was all a bit embarrassing.
Your mother never told anyone?
No. Sales of that photograph were paying her alimony. She wasn't about to throttle the goose while the golden eggs were still coming out of it.
Well, it would have saved a good deal of time, trouble, expense and inconvenience, Mrs. Troy, if your client had told us all this before.
I think he had his reasons, my lord, for keeping his own counsel.
Keeping her in what, Mrs. Troy? Continuous employment?
Continual, I hope, my lord. Mr. Mason has a considerable artistic reputation which may possibly be compromised by these revelations.
Yes, I see. Well, it's obviously pointless for the case to proceed. Case dismissed, no order for costs. And quite frankly, I'm glad to see the back of this one. And I, for one, won't be ordering any enlargements.
Oh, come on, Dad. Yeah, and I'll be doing stewed rabbit for doggy commercials. It's a pity when you got your button-down shirts, Justin, you didn't get yourself a button-down lip as well.
Everything all right, Mr. Mason?
Well, I suppose I ought to thank you, Mrs. Troy, but it might have been cheaper in the long run if we'd lost. Send the bill over, will you?
Don't worry, Mr. Mason, I'll get it off to you this afternoon.
Come on, Justin, I'll buy you a drink.
There's gratitude for you.
I thought you did very well there, Mrs. Troy. A few well-placed shots.
Thank you, Arthur, for collecting the ammunition. How's your complaint?
I'm trying homeopathy for it now.
Oh, good. Just as long as you don't try acupuncture.
There she goes. Find a father, lose a case.
Find a son, lose a reputation.
The law giveth, the law taketh away.
Yes, but mostly, Susan, the law just cocketh up.